Hello, and welcome to this webinar on Azure Security. Today I'll be taking you through a number of areas to help you improve the security of administrating your Azure environment. First, a bit about me. My name is Leo Darcy, and I'm one of the technology leads here at PowerON. I look after our Azure and security workloads, and I've been using Azure in anger since before Azure Resource Manager was released. Over recent years, Microsoft has heavily invested in capabilities to allow organizations to secure their Azure infrastructure. Some of these capabilities are passive, while others need enabling. The initial setup experience of Azure has also been designed to be as friction-free as possible. While this makes the process easier, it doesn't necessarily provide the security that organizations have come to expect from their infrastructure. Today, we're going to look at three common areas of Azure security: account management, conditional access, and the Azure Security Score. As most of you will already know, the authentication provider for Azure is Azure Active Directory. This provides four types of accounts for which you can use to authenticate. These account types are Microsoft accounts, cloud-based Azure Active Directory accounts, synchronized Azure Active Directory accounts, and business-to-business Azure Active Directory accounts. Microsoft accounts are designed for consumers to access Microsoft services such as Outlook or play on their Xbox. In general, it's not a good idea to use these accounts for business purposes, as the organization has limited control over these accounts. This includes password policies and who has access to the accounts. These accounts should be phased out and replaced with one of the other types of account where possible. Synchronized Azure Active Directory accounts use a synchronization tool such as Azure AD Connect to extend an on-premises account from a Windows Active Directory into a format usable from Azure AD. These accounts are useful as they also enable the synchronization of passwords so that users do not have to be aware that they are logging into anything other than their network. Cloud-based Azure Active Directory accounts are created natively in Azure Active Directory. This means that there is no reliance on external infrastructure such as Azure AD Connect or password checking infrastructure, which is also used with synchronized accounts. This limits the chances of systems going wrong and users being locked out of their accounts. This type of account makes a good break glass account for emergencies. Business-to-business Azure Active Directory accounts, or B2B accounts for short, are accounts which are owned and managed by another Azure AD tenant, but have been granted rights within another tenant. For example, here at PowerON we have Azure AD set up. It's possible for a customer to give me access to their resources through my PowerON credentials. This has the advantage that it makes managing customer Azure tenants easier for me, while providing reassurance to the customer that the account is secured and managed sensibly, as the password is unlikely to be written down, and if I was to leave PowerON, my account will be disabled by our IT team, as there may be a delay before customers get notified about my departure. For securing Azure, I recommend the following. Remove all Microsoft accounts with access to Azure. Separate off administration from daily working accounts. This is to minimize disruption caused by adding additional security measures, while also minimizing the opportunities for attackers to intercept or phish important credentials. And use B2B accounts for external organizational access where possible. Conditional access allows organizations to set up variable access policies depending on a number of attributes. These include the source IP address, user group assignment, device compliance, and the requirement for multi-factor authentication, amongst other things. Conditional access requires that the user has an Azure AD Premium 1 license. This is included in the EMNS and M365 E3 plans and above. It is highly recommended that multi-factor authentication is enabled for all privileged accounts, as according to Microsoft, 98% of all account compromises could be mitigated with the use of more than one factor of authentication. During this demo, I will walk you through the process of configuring multi-factor authentication for all Azure Active Directory privileged roles. We'll also turn on multi-factor authentication for any users who interact with the Azure or the ARM APIs. Worth noting at this point that there are a couple of caveats to deploying multi-factor authentication to admin users. The first is that to do this successfully, legacy authentication will need to be disabled. This is because legacy authentication protocols fundamentally don't support multi-factor authentication, so an attacker can just downgrade the authentication to legacy and bypass the multi-factor authentication prompt. Another point to note is that the multi-factor authentication will break privileged service accounts, which have been configured for automated tasks. This can either be handled by excluding them from authentication using specific groups, or the recommended solution is to transition to using either managed identities or service principals, as these are both typically more secure and not subject to multi-factor authentication requests. To modify conditional access, navigate to the Azure Active Directory service within portal.azure.com, or you can navigate to it directly from aad.portal.azure.com. From here, we're going to access the Azure Active Directory service on the left-hand side. And firstly, if you don't already have a license, if you don't have the licensing to support conditional access, Microsoft are providing a free solution called Security Defaults. These are available under Properties, Manage Security Defaults, and you can enable them from here. This performs a non-configurable set of lockdowns, including requiring multi-factor authentication for administrators and blocking legacy authentication. The key difference being with security defaults is that it will require all users to set up multi-factor authentication within 14 days of the user's first successful logon after enabling this policy. As such, it can be quite a disruptive policy to enable without prior planning and communication. More information on what this setting does can be found through the link on this blade. So under the security blade, you've got access to conditional access. By default, this displays a number of baseline policies which are classed as preview. These policies have now been deprecated in favour of the security baseline settings mentioned. While these policies provide a quick onboarding experience, they lack the ability to modify the policies, which limited their usefulness in most organisations. First, we're going to create a policy that blocks legacy authentication. To do this, we're going to go to New Policy, and we're going to give it a relevant name. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to select all users. And as this is a potentially risky conditional access policy, the system won't actually allow us to block all users for all apps, even if there's a specific condition. Therefore, what we actually have to do to get around this is we have to select an exclusion to one of these things. So in this case, we're going to select the global administrators, and we're going to hit done. Then under cloud apps, we're going to select all cloud apps. This ensures that the policy applies whatever the user is doing. And then under conditions, we want to go to client apps. We're going to configure it. I'm going to untick the modern authentication clients and the browser. This means that it's only going to block for the legacy old clients. And we'll hit done there. Then under grant, we select block. Final thing we do is we're going to enable the policy as a report only. So this final step is important as it allows you to identify any issues with the policy without impacting users or locking yourself out. In general, when making changes with potential significant impact, I would recommend running a policy in report mode for at least a week prior to enforcing the policy. So now we're just going to go back in and create this exact same configuration, but for global administrators. So this time we're just selecting the global administrator role. We still select all cloud apps. We then select our conditions, which was the client app. Untick browser, we untick those two. We hit done. We hit done here. Then under grant, we just select block again. And we're selecting report only. Now this time, because this policy affects the user account that I am on, it's suggesting that I exclude myself just to make sure that there is someone with the rights to come back in and modify this if there was a problem. Now in this case, because I'm using report mode, and I actually do want to block legacy authentication for everyone, because otherwise there is a vulnerability in this in our setup, I will accept the risk and I'll hit create. Now that we've blocked legacy authentication for all users, we can now enable multi-factor authentication for all Active Directory administrators. Firstly, we're going to create a new policy and then give it a new name, a sensible name. Then under users and groups, we'll select directory roles, and then we need to select all the roles. Fortunately, there is no select all button. And it should be noted that this doesn't cover the new custom roles that are currently in preview. If you've got custom roles, then you'll need to potentially come up with a separate way of authorizing and controlling those, potentially by using a separate security group, which you could also include in this policy. The other thing that we're going to do is we are going to exclude a organizational break glass account. This is so that if there is ever any problems with multi-factor authentication, we're still able to get in and disable multi-factor authentication until such time as the service starts working again. This account should have an extremely hard to guess password and should not be protected by either conditional access or be synchronized from Active Directory, either using a external password manager such as LastPass, or simply storing the password on a physical piece of paper in either a secure, safe, or vault is recommended. This account can then be excluded from this policy. Under Cloud Apps, we're going to select all Cloud Apps. And then we're not going to actually select any conditions, although it is possible to exclude known locations such as the external IP addresses of your organization to minimize the need for multi-factor authentication requests. This in itself is a security trade-off, as if an attacker was able to breach an internet-facing server or client computer, get the admin credentials, they would then be able to bypass the multi-factor authentication checks, securing the rest of the company. Finally, we need to go down to grant, and then under grant access, we require multi-factor authentication. And again, we select report only, and we don't exclude our account. Now for the final policy. This one is going to enforce multi-factor authentication for all users trying to access Azure resources, for example, for management of those. So we're going to give this a relevant name. And then in this case, we're going to select all users. And this time under Cloud Apps, we're just going to search for Azure. And then under here you can find the Microsoft Azure Management application, which we'll select. This app covers the Azure portal, PowerShell, REST APIs, and command line interface management tools. And then as before, we select grant and require multi-factor authentication. Then we put it into report only mode, and we don't exclude this account. So after logging out and logging back in again and potentially waiting a few minutes, you're able to inspect the status of these rules with the report only mode by going back to the main screen and then scrolling down to sign-ins. And you can see here is my successful sign-in, and under report only you can see that neither of the block rules would apply. But because I'm both a Azure administrator and an Azure Active Directory administrator, both of those would require multi-factor authentication. Okay, now that demo is completed, we're going to move on and talk about the Azure Security Score. The Azure Security Score provides a centralized overview of how different subscriptions fare in respect to security. These recommendations are broken down into compute, networking, data, and identity recommendations. Each recommendation has been provided a secure score impact. This helps organizations prioritize the most important recommendations first. Certain tasks have automated remediation activities associated with them. These are designated as quick fix recommendations, as it only requires the administrator to enable the remediation to complete the remediation. Like all generic advice, not all recommendations are relevant or even desired depending on the organization. A good example of this would be the recommendation for enabling disk encryption on all virtual machines. I wrote a detailed blog series on the advantages and disadvantages of this recommendation on our blog. The link is on screen, and it will also be included in the follow-up email to this webinar. Other recommendations, such as the advanced security for SQL servers or installing a vulnerability assessment tool, may incur additional costs. In these scenarios, it is important to remember that the security score is just a recommendation, and a full cost-benefit analysis should take place to determine if the extra security solution is desirable and would actually be used. The security score maximum is determined by the types of resources and the number of resources provisioned within the subscription. As such, it is not possible to compare the actual scores between subscriptions or organizations. In general, I would suggest the following. Enables the Security Center for all subscriptions. Review all recommendations and remediate where possible. Document and disable recommendations that will not be implemented. Use Azure policies to avoid new resources having the same vulnerabilities. So to conclude, we've talked about setting up the admin accounts for Azure Access, securing these accounts with conditional access, and finally how to identify and secure Azure resources. If you'd like any further assistance or more detailed plans for configuring and securing Azure, please feel free to get in touch with us at info@poweronplatforms.com. You can also reach out to me directly on Twitter at LeoDarcy1. Thank you very much for your time.